Hi students, it's Mrs. Top, and we're here for day 2 of our Civil Rights unit. Yesterday we watched a Brain Pop video and we did some worksheets related to that video, and today we're going to look at some primary sources that stick with the same theme of the Civil Rights Movement. So we should have this worksheet, or if you're following along online and using the digital assignments, that's fine too. We'll be doing the same thing. But what I want you guys to take a look at, we're going to be looking at a photo, and we're also going to be looking at another written primary source from the Civil Rights Movement. So we're going to get started just by reading the beginning of our worksheet here. Throughout the 1960s, civil rights supporters staged non-violent protests across the country. All right, let's stop there and talk about that. So throughout the 1960s, people who really wanted there to be equal rights and they wanted everyone to be treated the same, what they started doing was protesting. And it was very important to most of those people that all the protests were nonviolent. So they would do things like they would go places where together, so white people and black people would go places together where they were not supposed to be together, where they were segregated and separated. Now, being segregated and separated was against the law, but sometimes that doesn't matter. Sometimes people still wanted everyone to be separated, even though the law had changed and made that illegal. And so what the civil rights supporters would do is go into those places together to force them to allow integration, which is mixing of everybody in the same place. They would sometimes block the street, or they would do sit-ins, which is where they would go into a business and sit down. So all these things were nonviolent. They would do marches, like the March on Washington or the March in Selma. And all these things were protests, but they were always nonviolent. Even when the police or other people would be violent towards the protesters, they actually had special training that they went through to practice ignoring all of the violence that could be thrown at them, basically. All right. So let's go back to what we were reading. So it said, I'll read the first line again. Throughout the 1960s, civil rights supporters staged nonviolent protests across the country. Participants in these actions often went through intense training sessions. Examine the photo and the document and cite details to answer the following questions. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the photograph. Oops, sorry. So here is the photo. Now, this photo is called Tolerance Training for Civil Rights Activists. It was taken in Petersburg, Virginia in 1960 by Howard Shorrock. And it says, there's a little bit of text. Let me scroll down to read it to you. Before staging a sit-in at a segregated lunch counter, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, trained its protesters in sessions like this one. The instructors simulated the expected reactions of white patrons. So basically, this man and maybe this woman and maybe whoever is sitting over here they're getting ready to go and do a protest. They're going to do a sit-in. Which means they're going to go to a business, usually a lunch counter, which is like a cafe, and they're going to sit at the counter, even though a sign on the door might say whites only, or they know that white people don't want to have anyone else in the store. But it's illegal to keep people out of the store, so they're basically coming in and sitting down, and with their actions saying, you're not allowed to make me leave, and I'm going to stay here until you serve me. And the people didn't serve them. They ignored them, and other people would come up and harass them. So what you see in this picture are these two people are training this guy, basically saying, this is something that people can come up and do to you. They might come up and literally blow cigarette smoke in your face to try to get under your skin and try to disrespect you. And you have to be able to ignore it, basically, and just let it go. Which is obviously a really difficult thing to be able to do. Okay, so I want to show you a couple of a couple more primary sources. So we just saw the training picture, and this is a picture from the actual lunch counter when they're actually doing a sit-in. The man on the ground, who's actually probably a college student or even a high school student, his name is Walter Williams, and he's laying down on the floor like that because he's practicing nonviolence. Someone had thrown a glass at him. He had been hit by a glass object, and instead of fighting back or trying to run away, they probably had also pulled him off of his chair, because people would do that as well. They'd literally get in and pull people off the chairs, but they didn't fight back. They just kind of sat down, and you can see that his shirt has all kind of drinks and other stuff. These white boys had dumped drinks on him. You can see that the woman that he's as part of the protest with him is actually, she's talking to the person behind the counter, and you can imagine how difficult it would be if you had seen something happen to your friend to just sit there and try to ignore it and just try to sit there nonviolently and peacefully. That's probably the hardest thing. It was probably easier when it was you to ignore it, but can you imagine sitting there and watching people be cruel and even violent towards your friend and not be able to do anything to fight back? That was what they were trained to do, because it was really important for them to show, we are not violent people. We are not trying to create a violent situation. We just want to be served a sandwich or a coffee. So here's another image I can show you. A similar thing. We see a white crowd of mostly boys. In this case, you can actually see them dumping liquid on the protesters' heads. So this was very common, and this is what happened all the time. I will also point out there is we've only seen people at the lunch counter who've been having black protesters, but there were also white protesters, and they were treated with the same harshness, because also the other white people saw them more as traitors. This is another image similar to the last one, where again you can see these two folks are sitting are sitting at the counter as well, and you can see that the white men who are pouring drinks on them and harassing them are doing that regardless of the color of their skin. These two people are white, this woman is black, and they're still harassing all of them. You can see this girl's laughing. This older person is watching, doesn't seem to be worried about it. So they were just treating them obviously terribly. And this was at a lunch counter called Woolworths, where the protest really took place. So we've seen some primary sources, some images, and now we're going to look at another primary source. This is an excerpt from the Constitution of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And that was a group. It is abbreviated SNCC. They pronounced it SNCC. That was a group that was, like it sounds like, it was a group of college students that were organizing these sit-ins and other protests during the civil rights movement. So this is part of their constitution. Basically, it's what SNCC, the group, said that they stood for. All right, I'm going to read it to you, and then we're going to go to answering our questions. The purpose. We accept the following statement of purpose adopted at the Raleigh Conference in 1960 as the basis for our actions. We affirm the philosophical or religious ideal of nonviolence as the foundation of our purpose, the presupposition of our faith, and the manner of our action. Nonviolence, as it grows from the Judeo-Christian tradition, seeks a social order of justice permeated by love. The integration of human endeavor represents the crucial first step towards such a society. Through nonviolence, courage displaces fear. Love transforms hate. Acceptance dissipates prejudice. Hope ends despair. Peace dominates war. Faith reconciles doubt. Mutual regard cancels enmity. Justice for all overcomes injustice. The redemptive community supersedes systems of gross social immorality. Love is the central motif of nonviolence. Love is the force by which God binds man to himself and man to man. Such love goes to the extreme. It remains loving and forgiving even in the midst of hostility. It matches the capacity of evil to inflict suffering with an even more enduring capacity to absorb evil, all while persisting in love. By appealing to conscience and standing in the moral nature of human existence, nonviolence nurtures the atmosphere in which reconciliation and justice become actual possibilities. So in this section, what we heard them say is that they are committed to nonviolence because nonviolence is basically they reference Jesus in terms of talking about Judeo-Christian traditions. They talk about basically through nonviolence, courage displaces fear, love transforms hate. So yes, we could stand up and if you guys pour stuff on us, we could beat you up right back. But what would that teach anyone is basically their message. Their message is the only way for us to prove that love can overcome hate is to only show love and to only show nonviolence. We're going to read the rest of this right here. SNCC shall serve as a channel of coordination and communication for the student movement. By direction of its executive committee, through its staff, it shall have authority to initiate programs in areas where none presently exists and to work closely with the local protest groups in the intensification and extension of the movement. So basically, they are going to communicate and coordinate protests. SNCC shall be responsible for the distribution and communication of news regarding any of the staff or local groups. It will publish a newsletter called The Student Voice as often as possible, which shall cover news of the student movement as a whole. In addition, SNCC shall be responsible for the distribution and interpretation of information to local groups which is of specific interest to the student movement. Remember, there are no cell phones, there is no internet, there are TVs and radios, but they don't have information the same way that we do, so they're promising to share accurate information and to produce this newsletter that people can trust called The Student Voice. SNCC shall be responsible for calling a conference of the whole student movement each year on the Easter weekend and any other conferences the coordinating committee deems necessary. These conferences shall be open to all, primarily educational in nature, and shall be a time when information is exchanged between areas. So this is all part of, like I said, SNCC. And that is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So you have this to refer back to. And now I'm going to read you a couple of the questions here. And you guys are going to go ahead and answer them on your own. But I will go ahead and talk through some of them with you, and then you can go back and write your full answers, okay? So let's look at the first question. It says, what does the necessity of training in nonviolence indicate about the protesters' understanding of American society? All right, so that question is basically saying, why would they assume they're going to need training? What do they think is going to happen, and why? What do they know about the way American society is? Right? They basically already know about racism. They know that they are going to be putting themselves in the way of violence by standing up to racism, and basically they understand that American society is racist and that people who are racist will become violent in order to maintain a racist society. Number 2, how does segregation stand in opposition to the ideals expressed in the SNCC Constitution? So if we think back to what we just read, and it's asking basically, why don't the founders of SNCC, why are they against segregation? What did they say that would make you think they don't like segregation? So number 3 asks, how does the training depicted in the photo, or we actually looked at multiple photos, how does the training in the photo bear out the SNCC Constitution? And what that means is we heard in the SNCC Constitution that everyone who was in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was going to be nonviolent because that was a way to change people and to change society. Did we actually see them doing that nonviolence in the photos? I want you to use some evidence to prove that we did. Number 4 says, given the treatment that they can expect, what are the ideal traits of a nonviolent protester? So I want you to think, what would make someone really good at doing this kind of protest? Would you be able to do it? What kind of person would be able to go in and sit there? If you were looking for people to do this type of protest, what kind of person would you be looking for? And think about whether you could handle it. And question 5, is the SNCC's philosophy practical? does it make sense? Does it actually work? Support your position with historic or contemporary evidence. So that's basically saying it's all nice that they want to be nonviolent. Does it work?